Hello, and welcome to this webinar on malicious browser extensions. My name is Mark Orlando, and I'm the field CTO at Push Security. Today's session is going to be a deep dive into this new and frankly pretty fast growing threat. We're going to talk about how attackers can weaponize browser extensions to steal data and do all kinds of other nefarious things, oftentimes without the victim even being aware that it's happening. We're going to talk about how you can spot malicious extensions, or at least make informed risk decisions about what extensions you want in your environment and which you don't. We'll talk about some operational pitfalls to watch out for when managing extensions, especially if you are relying on store level security checks and controls, which, as we'll discuss, are not always effective in identifying these threats. And finally, we'll talk through a step-by-step playbook for assessing the risk of malicious browser extensions in your organization and taking a series of steps that will reduce your risk, hopefully down to virtually zero. So let's get going. The first part of this session, we're going to spend talking about how malicious extensions work and some of the internals that enable attackers to weaponize them to great effect. We'll start by looking at this example, AI Assistant, a seemingly legitimate extension which you could find, at least at one point you could find in the Chrome Web Store. And for all intents and purposes, this extension appears legitimate. We've got a feature tag in here, a rating of 3.9 stars, not stellar, but certainly not really suspicious. We've got 50,000 users who have this installed, and it's topical, right? We could imagine users going out and searching for all manner of AI agent or AI assistant browser extensions to help them in their daily work. Unfortunately, this is in fact a malicious extension, and it was discovered earlier this year to be part of an attack campaign, which resulted in sensitive data theft, credentials, emails from over 300,000 users. So despite the fact that it was listed in the Chrome Web Store and appeared to be legitimate based on a variety of kind of visual cues here, was in fact malicious. I want to share with you a second example of a malicious extension that the Push Security research team observed in the wild. And what I want to highlight here most specifically is the delivery method. So you can see here we're doing a Bing search for the Wayback Machine and clicking on one of the first search results, really high in the list. When we go to visit the homepage, we are presented with an ad blocker pop-up. When you click that, you're redirected to install this ad dimmer extension. But again, we're seeing the Chrome Web Store branding, the Web Store listing here, but look how fast that happened. We went from search result to installing the extension, which by the way, was actually malicious, in less than a minute. Now think about this kind of thing happening over and over all day throughout medium or large or even small enterprise. It can be kind of difficult, despite these few examples, to talk through some of the internals or to look at some of the internals of a malicious extension because there is an intelligent attacker on the other end who is intentionally trying to obfuscate that malicious behavior or some of that functionality. And there are lots of different ways they might do that, but for the purposes of this discussion, it's going to be much easier for us to walk through an extension that I've created specifically for the purpose of this demo. Enter Time Tracker Pro. Let's assume that this extension, which I've created for this session, has been in the Chrome Web Store for a few years now, has very high ratings, over 2 million user deployments, and great reviews. Again, it looks legitimate, as did the other two examples of real malicious extensions that we've seen in the wild. Now, I want to walk through, what types of things are happening under the hood here that are easily abused or weaponized by an attacker. So here we can see the extension is installed in my browser, push standard extension test file. It's kind of a riff on the old iCar file we used to use to test antivirus. If we open up the manifest.json file, this is a file that comes with all extensions, and you can think of it as kind of a blueprint for how the extension operates. And most importantly, we can see the permissions here that the extension is granted. We've got extension level permissions, which is the top list, and we have host level permissions. You can think of extension permissions as tools in a toolbox. Here are all the things that the extension is able to do within the browser. The host permissions we can think of as the keys, or maybe what the extension has access to in order to perform all of those tasks. And we can see here in this manifest file that we've got the all URLs host permissions, which is a really broad set of permissions that basically says we can do these set of permissions at any site, anywhere. If we were to walk through these permissions one by one, there's nothing in here that jumps out at us as inherently malicious. These are all permissions that a perfectly legitimate extension could require. So if we look at cookies, for example, let's say that the extension requires us to remain logged in throughout a session. It might use access to the cookies to facilitate that, right? We might want to improve how a web page behaves or appears. We might leverage the scripting permission for that. We might want to save preferences and require the storage permission for that. So again, all sorts of reasons why a legitimate extension might require these permissions. Now we're going to come back to this list in a minute, but first I want to show you some of the functionality in practice that we might see in an extension based on these permissions. So in order to do that, I'm going to fire up an app I created for this demo called Cloud Task Pro. Let's consider this, just another SaaS app for project tracking. So if I pop open the console here so that we can see what the extension is doing kind of in the background, and I open up the console, I can see that when I've logged in, the extension intercepted my login information, my username, my password, as well as my session token for this now authenticated session. So we're doing some credential and session harvesting here. If I then move over to create a project, let's say this is a super secret project and I'm putting all kinds of sensitive intellectual property in the description field here. The extension can already see that I'm entering data into the form. And when I hit create project and submit that form data, it is also intercepted by the extension and stored locally. We can see that data right here in the console as well. Let's also assume that I want to create a new user, or I want to change some of my own user details. Again, when I click Save Changes, the form data is submitted, and thanks to the permissions granted to this extension, that data is also captured and stored locally here. So we've seen kind of three pseudo attack scenarios here. We've seen credential harvesting, session token harvesting. We've seen sensitive data gathering, and we've seen some PII scraping here, right? All thanks to the permissions granted to this extension. So let's take another look at those permissions through a more kind of critical lens. In this case, that all URLs and the tabs permissions basically provide the extension of global access to surveil any site and any interaction we might have in the browser. So that's pretty powerful, right? In fact, might be overly broad for most extensions. If we take another look at this scripting permission, right, that allows us to maybe manipulate, otherwise interact with web pages, this is what is allowing us to capture the data submitted via those forms. The cookies permission, in this case, allows us to capture that session data, that session token for the authenticated session in this application. And in fact, in any applications that I might log into or authenticate to in this browser. And the storage permission allows us to store this sensitive data. Now, at this point, maybe kind of our suspicions are elevated, but so far, all of the data still remains local. It's still being stored, here in the browser storage. So the question now might be, is there some way that this extension could offload this data, right? Send it somewhere outside of my environment that I don't want it going? And the answer is absolutely yes. And part of that answer lies in the alarms permission, which we can also see here in the list. So let's jump back over to the extension listing and take a look at the service worker for that extension. And I'm going to reopen the console here and kind of take a look at some other settings as well as the contents of local storage. So if I refresh the view here, I've got a few different kind of keys enumerated here. In the collected data key, the value includes this handful of arrays where all of that sensitive data is now stored. You can see we've got my credentials, we've got that sensitive project information, we've got some of that PII. In the last collection key, we also see this endpoint defined, which is our URL example.com/API/collect. So I have defined an API endpoint in there. Why might we do that? Well, here it is to kind of demonstrate that I could define a remote endpoint where I could post all of that sensitive data to. So where is that functionality within the extension? The answer lies back in another file that came with the extension called background.js. Now, the existence of this file is not in and of itself suspicious. Background scripts are perfectly normal functionality. You can consider them like a server component or a coordinator function for the extension. In this case, if we pop open the background.js file for my test extension, I can see this base64 encoded string, right? The two equal signs at the end, kind of a dead giveaway that we've got some encoded data here. Now, this isn't too sneaky. I can very easily decode this. And if I did, I would see that API endpoint, example.com. But the key here is that automated scanners, automated analyses that might be looking for external URLs may miss this content simply by virtue of the base64 encoded string here. So pretty simple, straightforward example. I'm not doing any kind of complicated obfuscation here, but suffice to say, I have a very risky extension here that, while perhaps not inherently malicious or obviously malicious, certainly has the ability to do some very concerning things. Now, let's talk about kind of the landscape more broadly where extensions are concerned. And if we look at some of the most kind of significant campaigns over the last few years reported from 2024 through to the present, we would kind of be amiss not to mention Dark Spectre. So this is actually a set of campaigns, Chinese state-sponsored activity of malicious extensions that compromised almost 9 million users, involved 100 plus different extensions. There was the Zoom Stealer campaign, Shady Panda, Ghost Poster. These are all campaigns associated with this Dark Spectre activity. And I think most interestingly, this campaign ran for 7 years. And a lot of that came down to kind of the slow, methodical staging of these malicious extensions. And then at a certain point, the weaponization of those extensions for mass surveillance, data gathering, and other malicious activities. Now, there are a number of other major campaigns. You can see some of these listed here, like Trust Wallet, which is mostly about cryptocurrency theft, the Cyberhaven campaign, where we had a legitimate cybersecurity tool that was compromised, impacting 2.6 million users. But what I want you to take away from this graphic is that just from a few years ago to now, especially late 2025 and into Q1 of this year, there has been an exponential increase in these reported campaigns. And this is just what we're seeing, what we know about. So it does seem that these attacks are trending upward. This is becoming more of a problem than maybe it once was just a few years ago. So there are a couple of different ways that these extensions get distributed. Right? The first way is distributing them as you would any other malicious payload. And I showed you an example of that at the start of our session today with some of that SEO poisoning type behavior where we were redirected to a site, redirected to another site to then install, a seemingly benign extension. So that's one way, but we're seeing all kinds of different social engineering attacks coming certainly through email, but also via malicious advertising, social media DMs, in-app notifications, you name it. Oftentimes, these attack chains involve some sort of redirection through seemingly legitimate sites and services to then ultimately land on the distribution page for the malicious extension. So that's one way. The second way is an extension that maybe didn't start out bad, but is then taken over by a malicious party. And this can happen a few different ways. The developer of the extension might get phished and then have their access compromised, where the attacker can then push a malicious update, which is what happened in the Cyberhaven campaign. An attacker might build their own extension and then upload that and then kind of wait until it achieves a certain deployment number and then introduce malicious capabilities. Or perhaps the simplest way is for an attacker to simply buy a legitimate extension that already has a healthy install base, decent reviews, has that air of legitimacy about it. So imagine that you're a one-person developer shop. You maintain an extension as kind of a side project. Someone comes along, offers to pay you a bag of money, let's say $10,000 for that extension. Great, you hand it over, and now the attacker has full access. They are now the legitimate developer for that app, and they can upload, push whatever kind of new features and functionality they want. So let's take a look back at those two examples that I showed you up front, this ad dimmer extension and the AI assistant extension. Both of these look pretty legit, as we already saw, even if the route to get to download that ad dimmer one was a little bit sketchy for more, let's say, paranoid users. But extensions with higher install counts, like we see here with the AI assistant and its 50,000 users, they can easily be turned malicious without targeting users, without any kind of phishing or user interaction. Remember, those are 50,000 users that have already installed, already permitted access to this extension. So weaponizing that extension is as easy and as quiet as pushing an update that happens in the background, and the user is none the wiser. So if this is such a huge problem and seemingly growing larger by the month and by the year, why aren't we detecting these consistently? And there are a few different reasons for this. The first is that attackers are working very hard to pass web store code analysis and other security checks, and they can do that using a variety of different obfuscation methods. One is to dynamically load content, where they've got kind of short chunks of benign code that then load the malicious code from external sources, and they do it dynamically at runtime, so that if you're doing static analysis of just the extension at a point in time, you're not going to see those malicious features. In some cases, attackers, as I said, will upload perfectly legitimate benign extensions and kind of let those run for a while before then pushing an update that introduces those malicious features. And even when these extensions are identified and removed from a web store, they can be reskinned, repackaged, re-uploaded, and the process starts all over again. In fact, I was recently reviewing some research where an attacker had been observed, or a group of attackers had been observed to be flooding web stores with a lot of very similar extensions, named similarly, very similar capabilities, but all in the same kind of category, right? Kind of flood the zone, if you will. And some of these techniques, whether it's obfuscation, whether it's doing some kind of sophisticated methods of waiting between check-ins, only loading malicious payloads some of the time, we're seeing these quite often out in the wild, whether it's in the Cyberhaven incident, Ghost Poster, where oftentimes the malicious payload wasn't even loaded, and therefore the attackers were able to evade detection for quite some time. Now, when it comes to what the extensions actually do, that varies quite widely as well. And whether it's some of the campaigns that we talked about a few minutes ago, some of the things we're seeing today in the wild, most of these extensions fall into one or more of these categories. Either it's crypto theft, it's session token theft or ad fraud or data profiling and surveillance. And if we were to plot these out, as you see on the screen, the most prevalent extensions that we've seen based on our research involve surveillance and data profiling, affiliate and ad fraud. Those seem to be the most common types of extensions, while of course, session token theft in terms of risk would be kind of the most critical, right? Remember, this is material for an authenticated session. So we don't have to steal credentials. We don't have to trick the user into logging into anything. We can simply replay that session using that token. So while it might not be the most prevalent or the most common, at least based on what we're seeing or what's being reported, certainly that has the highest level of risk. So how do attackers leverage malicious extensions as part of a larger attack chain? If we were to boil that down into very kind of simple terms, here's what that attack chain might look like. We deploy a malicious extension or a malicious update to an extension that already exists in user browsers. We then use the extension and the associated permissions to steal credentials, session cookies, do data exfiltration, as we discussed in the step-by-step demo we did a few minutes ago. We then leverage those credentials and session material to hijack critical applications, access sensitive data, and then use that data for resale, extortion, or some other type of monetization method, right? So fundamentally, at least where we end up and how the data gets monetized, very similar to what we're seeing in a lot of the other attacks that we see happening today. A lot of these in-browser threats, identity-focused attacks, ultimately have the same end goal. The malicious browser extension is simply another means to that goal. And as I said, based on what we're seeing today, the prevalence of this problem, this is becoming a very common method of achieving that end goal. So one of the nuances here, when we talk about whether an extension is malicious or not, is this a bad extension? Is it a good extension? Certainly there are some cases where we know that an extension is being weaponized. We know that it's being used in an attack campaign. But there are many, many other situations where the conditions simply exist for an extension to be easily abused or easily weaponized for account takeover or some of the other things that we've talked about, some of the other attacker goals. So in that nuance, really we're talking about combinations of permissions. And we kind of walked through this in the demo, right? And if we were to categorize those things, we might do that in this way. So there are certain combinations of extensions that have critical risk levels for directly hijacking an authenticated session. There are other combinations of permissions that have maybe not critical, but certainly an elevated risk or a high risk of credential theft. Okay. So I don't know if anyone remembers the original Tim Burton Batman movie where the whole thing was the Joker was targeting consumers through cosmetic products. And it was like one of the products, if you just used the one, it was fine. But the chemical composition meant that if you used multiple products together, then you would like turn into the Joker or something. It was weird. If you don't get it, that's okay. But my point is that it's not just about, this permission is bad or malicious, but rather it's this combination of permissions when used together that an attacker can leverage for ATO. So here's some research that I wanted to share from the Push Security research team. And I want to call out here that the team is doing applied research, not only of malicious browser extensions, but all manner of in-browser threats all the time. And it's this work that drives our detections, a lot of our product features. And so what we're seeing in our data set where extensions are concerned is that over 3 in 5 installed extensions can be abused for session theft. So we are seeing those critical permissions. If we were to put a number to it, 63% of installed extensions have those permission combinations that could be abused to achieve account takeover. And here's the breakdown of those numbers here in this chart. for specific permission combinations that we're seeing and how often we're seeing them. So it's a pretty big number. And what we're seeing, even in non-malicious but over permissioned extensions, is that we're giving very broad access globally to a lot of these installed extensions, even if they're not actively being abused. Certainly, there's a lot of risk there. Now let's talk about how you can secure browser extensions in your environment. And I want to talk, of course, about the approach that we're taking here and some of the capabilities that having a control in your browser, like the push extension, can afford you when it comes to dealing with malicious extensions. So the big challenge that's facing security teams now is that the Chrome Web Store has over 100,000 extensions. And of course, I called out a few examples of known malicious extensions that, at least at one time, were hosted in the Chrome Web Store. And if you've allowed employees to install any extension they want, you could have hundreds of thousands of extensions in your environment. Now, I'm sometimes asked by customers and people that I talk to about browser extensions, hey, if we're relying on the web store to do some of those security checks, isn't that enough? Like, doesn't Google care? And I think it's not a matter of caring, but rather a matter of scale. This problem is of such scale, and new extensions are coming in at a rate that makes it very difficult, even when you're doing security checks and you have stringent kind of security requirements or audit requirements for those web stores, things are still going to get through. And that's especially true when you've got attackers on the other end who are purposefully trying to evade those security checks. So things do get through, and quite often. It also doesn't help that AI-assisted development has served as this kind of force multiplier for cranking out those malicious extensions. So attackers can create those, run them through the process, try to get them uploaded, at a rate which, prior to the availability of these tools, might have been more difficult to do it kind of at the volume that they're doing it today. And it's important to take away that every extension installed in your web browsers expands your potential attack surface. That increases your risk. That's attack surface that could be leveraged by an attacker. So if you go back to your desk after this webinar and you grab just a user at random and you take a look at the extensions that they have installed, it might look something like this, a hodgepodge of AI assistants and color pickers and shopping assistants and screen recorders and all kinds of other things. But the question is, would you really be comfortable with employees using all of these extensions, even if today, right now, there's nothing wrong with these, or at least they're not being weaponized in an attack, right? Should your users be able to install any extension they like? And that's more of a risk appetite decision. And it's one that, generally our approach is to provide you with as much information as possible, enough of the context that I've been talking about, so that you can make that risk-based informed decision for yourself. But of course, the fewer extensions, the better. That's not always possible. So let's talk instead about a more practical approach to getting your arms around this problem, starting with getting visibility. And that's something that, providing the telemetry that we provide in the browser across your user base, that's very powerful in terms of getting access to what users are doing, what existing extensions are out there in your environment, permissions they have, number of deployments, method of deployment, and a lot of other those contextual details that are very important. And then we want to make some risk decisions, right? Assess the risk of those extensions in your environment based on some of those details, and I'll show you some of those in a moment. And then we want to start applying controls. So it's not enough to hope that we're going to detect malicious extensions when they pop up. We know that is hit or miss. But rather, we want to exercise some control over what extensions users can and cannot install. So that means creating some kind of allow list and then blocking any unapproved or unauthorized extensions. After we apply that mitigating control, then we simply go into ongoing monitoring and response as needed. So we're periodically checking for risky or interesting changes that might change our risk calculus for a given extension. If you can follow these steps and do it in a comprehensive, ongoing way, you can reduce the risk posed by malicious extensions down to virtually zero. So let's talk about it. Steps 1 and 2, building an inventory, looking for risky configs. Now, whenever you say inventory to me as a former CTO and a former blue teamer, my eyes roll into the back of my head and I think, okay, it's a very simple word with a very complicated and expensive and time-consuming project behind it. So how do we build an inventory of browser extensions globally across our user base? Well, it turns out if you have an agent, i.e. the browser push extension, deployed, this is actually very easy to do. So you can see here in the push product, we're showing 65 unique extensions deployed throughout an enterprise. And not only the extensions, but you can see globally, based on the web store, how many people are using or have this extension installed. You can see the method of deployment. And by the way, it is possible for users to manually install via web store, but also for applications or services to sideload, install extensions. So we want to see those the deployment methods. We want to see how many people have the extension. And you can slice and dice that inventory a variety of different ways in the push console. So we can filter by browser people are using. We can filter by deployment method. We can look at permissions. Now, remember, we talked about some permissions or permission combinations being a little bit riskier. So we can audit those permissions, again, globally across our user base, provided they have the push extension installed. And we can see here, okay, out of all the extensions I've got, do any have any of those kind of suspicious attributes, right? Maybe fewer installs, maybe suspicious contact information, or very recently updated, or it has some of those permissions that we view as being somewhat risky or easily weaponized by an attacker. We can also see in that extension history if any of those details, like contact information, have changed recently. So that's pretty important. We can also, as I'll show you in a little bit, build detections around some of these things. And that's where some of the ongoing monitoring steps come in. But for now, it's all about building that inventory and starting to make some risk decisions around what extensions we may or may not want in the environment. So that's steps 1 and 2. Step 3 is to create an allow list of approved extensions and start to implement some mitigating controls around extensions in your environment. So here's how this works. If you've ever managed a firewall or built a firewall policy where you have deny by default, which is a rule at the bottom of the policy, and then exceptions above that, then this process should be very familiar to you. So in this control called browser extension blocking within push, what you're seeing here is we're creating a block rule that disables all browser extensions for all employees. So that's going to go at the bottom of our policy. And then above that, we are going to add in exceptions for, in this case, password managers. Of course, we want to permit the push extension to run as well. So those are going to go in above that deny all or the block all rule. And now we've got a deny by default with only explicitly allowed extensions able to run. And so if you go at the back to the installed extensions view here, you can see several of these are now switched off. They're disabled, effectively rendering them inert. We can uninstall them. The user can uninstall them, or if these are managed, we can uninstall them. But any attempts to go back and reinstall or interact with that extension in any way is going to be met with this block banner, as these are no longer approved for use. Step 4, now we have implemented some controls here. We've mitigated a good bit of our risk. So now we just want to monitor for changes over time. So these risk decisions are great for right now, but as extensions change, as ownership changes or permissions change, we want to be kept aware of those so we can reevaluate as needed. You're going to find a lot of that information in our event telemetry and in our detections. So we're going to let you know if, for example, contact email changes for an extension. And there are plenty of real world examples where previously legitimate extensions have been taken over and weaponized by an attacker. And a change in the developer or the developer contact is a great precursor to that weaponization. Great leading indicator that something may be changing, not always, but certainly, something that we want to pay attention to might change that kind of risk calculus. So you can see this as an event in the platform. We're also throwing, webhook for this event in case you're ingesting it into a SOAR playbook or a SIM or something like that. It's also worth mentioning that using push, we can block known bad extensions as well. So we've kind of focused on making risk-based decisions and looking out for kind of riskier extensions. But of course, there are going to be scenarios where we know a specific extension has been weaponized or is being used in an attack campaign. And in those scenarios, we also have a control in the product that you can use to go in and explicitly block a known bad extension. And that is in the malicious browser extension detection control. This is a customizable rule set to either warn, block outright for all employees, a specific employee, or an employee group. And you can even customize kind of the banner message that gets presented to the user for that. So you can see here, we have executed this block rule for a very specific extension. It's now disabled. If you try to interact with this extension, try to load it, try to reinstall it, the user is going to be prevented from doing that. And you can see here, we're throwing detections for that as well, along with context, if it's relevant around what threat intelligence led us to make this determination, things like that. You can see here the block page for those known bad extensions. So real quick, a cheat sheet for our malicious extension or risky extension playbook here. First, we need to take inventory, see what's out there, and investigate any suspicious or risky extensions. We then want to implement some policies that enable us to block globally any unapproved or unknown extensions, regularly review that policy, and monitor for any changes. If we encounter a known malicious or weaponized extension, that's when we invoke our incident response process. Part of that process may be to review some of the event telemetry and push or detections. And perhaps if it's not already active, to then block known malicious extensions. I should also highlight if it's not already clear, that today we are already blocking known malicious extensions and throwing detections for those as well based on the threat intelligence that we are gathering and collecting. So a little bit of day one protection here for those known malicious extensions, but certainly the capability to create and tune policies as part of containment and eradication if necessary. Just a quick recap of those risk indicators. Has the extension been linked to a malicious campaign? That's a pretty obvious one. Does the extension have permissions or permission combinations which could be abused to achieve account takeover or other kind of nefarious goals? Has ownership changed recently? Does the extension have a low install count that indicates it may not be trustworthy? Right? I compare that a little bit to looking for malicious domains or websites by visit count. If no one ever visits this URL or domain, or it's the first time anyone has ever gone to it, chances might be higher it's suspicious. Same kind of logic here. If an extension is not deployed widely, not many people have it globally, then it might be worth a second look. So that about covers it for our discussion of malicious browser extensions. But I want to highlight the fantastic research that our team is doing on a daily basis, that is applied research that directly drives our detections, a lot of the features and capabilities of the push security product. And we have released this ebook, which you can download for free at the URL here on the slide, outlining all manner of different browser attack techniques and browser threats that we've identified in the wild, including, but far beyond just malicious browser extensions. So highly recommend you check that out. Lots of great intel in there. And with that, I want to thank you all for listening. If you're watching this live, I'm around for any questions. Alternatively, you can always find me on LinkedIn or reach out to me at mark.orlando@pushsecurity.com. So thank you very much for joining me. Would love to take any questions that you have, and stay safe out there.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Mark. So we've had lots of questions come in so far. So it's probably a good idea to start working through some of those, but there's still time to ask questions. If there are any more you'd like to ask, please just put them in there and we'll get to as many as we can. So without further ado, let's start with, does web content filtering prevent some of these issues? For example, Zscaler or Cloudflare Zero Trust?
Yeah, and I mentioned for this one that unfortunately those network-based controls do not really help here at all, because everything that the extensions are doing, of course, that's happening in the browser on the endpoint. Any kind of traffic they might initiate, all that stuff is happening kind of pre-HTTPS encryption. So a lot of the content, of course, is going to be blind, or the network controls are going to be blind to that content. And if you're thinking about, well, maybe I'll catch the extensions if they're doing data exfiltration or generating some other network traffic, attackers are pretty wise to that. So they're using a lot of legitimate sites and services and other obfuscation methods to hide. So your network-based or proxy-based controls are not going to be helpful here.
Yeah, and I suppose to add to that, you're literally downloading these from the extension store as well. It's a legitimate, seemingly legitimate, delivered through a legitimate channel. Yeah, absolutely. We've had a couple of questions relating to how we're identifying malicious extensions. So there's one here on what sources of intel is Push using to detect malicious extensions. And then we've had a later question on are our known bad extensions based on our own threat intel, or is it public intel? So maybe you can talk a little bit about those kind of things together.
Yeah, of course. And it's a great question. And I'm reminded of my time as a SOC manager and as a CTO asking this same question whenever any vendor would bring up intel. And I'm about to give the same kind of answer that I really disliked when I would get. But I have some qualifications for that. So the answer is it's a variety of different sources. There's some open source intel that we're getting from, research, blogs, feeds, things like that. We do have some closed intel partnerships that we leverage for what we do. But I think the biggest thing that I want to talk about here is our applied research team. And there are a lot of vendors out there that claim that they have a research capability, but the research team that we have is a part of our product organization. They are doing applied research every day to look at these things, to pour over the research that's out there, to look at samples that we see that we're collecting, and that's where the intel comes from. It's a combination of those things. So when you see detections or features in the product, and specifically when we flag a known malicious extension, it's either coming from originally maybe some open source research, but all of that stuff is kind of filtered through the applied research team. So it's very high fidelity and validated intel.
Yeah, I think just to build on that a little bit as well, obviously the Google Chrome store and all of the other extension stores are doing their own layers of static analysis, for example. And as you mentioned earlier in the session, a lot of that is being bypassed by dynamically loaded content that isn't assessed at that stage. Then you have kind of sandbox style analysis. Well, that doesn't really apply if the payload is only triggering 10% of the time and there's a 48-hour delay. You can't run a sandbox for 48 hours. I don't know any organization who would be doing that. It would be prohibitively expensive, to say the least. So, some of the things that we're looking at when we're trying to identify malicious is through the behaviors around how extensions are being installed, where they're being navigated to from, what are the changes that these extensions are making on the pages, for example, like common behaviors being things like downgrading the content security policy on the page. Like legit extensions can do that sometimes, but sometimes malicious extensions do it pretty reliably. So there's a number of things that we're also looking at to kind of build out our own portfolio of malicious detections, but based on the behaviors in the browser, as opposed to trying to look at it just from the code or just from a sandbox type view. Yeah. Would you add to that? Yeah.
That's where that applied research becomes so important, is figuring out what all those little bits of context and all those markers, what those things look like, so we can kind of build that back into detections and into the product. So, but yeah, all great points.
Great. Okay. At an architectural level, what measures should an organization follow to avoid this risk?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that often comes up when you talk about kind of architectural approaches to mitigating risks like this is using MDM or enterprise browsers, tools like that. Those would be part of your security architecture. And I think to some extent, I would agree that those are kind of fundamental components of a secure architecture that would start to help you address a problem like this. But where those are limited, and where I would say that, as self-serving as it sounds, you have to have a control like push operating inside the browser and generating some telemetry. And the reason for that is because those kind of more foundational architectural solutions like MDM, or if you've got enterprise browsers, those are fine for trying to kind of implement a base policy for what users can and can't do, what they can and can't install. However, what those solutions don't do is provide that ongoing telemetry and ongoing monitoring. And I think what we've covered here in the webinar is that so many of these things are benign or normal for a pretty long time until they're not. And it's those subtle changes or intentional delays in order to evade detection that that's not something that those MDM or secure browser are going to catch. And so you have to have that visibility inside the browser, be able to do that ongoing monitoring and detection above and beyond any kind of policy-based control. The second thing I would point out here is that in environments where you have different types of web browsers, which I think are most environments, users want to kind of use whatever they choose. You need a solution that covers multiple different browsers. So that's certainly an area where having a standard enterprise browser that can be helpful, but it's really not going to address kind of these modern threats where users are using a variety of different browsers. So again, you need to have a cross-browser kind of agent that sits right there and can sort of provide the kind of visibility and telemetry we're talking about.
A good sort of follow-up to that one would be, there's been a few questions around well, what browsers we support, and also how does push deal with unmanaged browsers? So maybe you can just add a little bit on both of those points there.
Of course, yeah, and I think the answer, and I think Dan, you dropped this in the chat, is all major enterprise grade browsers we support: Chrome, Firefox, Edge, even some of the more like purpose-built kind of what I would consider niche browsers. If it's Chromium based, if it supports extensions, then you can deploy push inside of it. So I think that's for the browser support question. On the unmanaged browser question, we also support unmanaged browsers. Usually that's just a question of how the push extension gets deployed to those browsers, but we do have a variety of different options for how you can get those installed as well, even in an unmanaged environment. So lots of flexibility for deployment. We've tried to make that as easy as possible.
Great. Question here: how can we proceed with blocking currently used extensions within the organization without disrupting users who rely on them, and ensure the transition is handled smoothly?
Yeah, good question from Nadeem here. And I think this gets to the playbook that I described near the end of the webinar, where, obviously, and I think this gets to Nadeem's question, is you can't just go out and summarily block a variety of different productivity tools that users are used to using or that they rely on. So we advocate starting with building that inventory. That was kind of step one of the playbook that I described. You have to get some visibility in there and really just start to kind of work down the list in terms of riskiest or most unapproved extensions to things that may be okay, but you want to have maybe a standardized solution for, or something like that. So I would say, kind of short answer here, you have to start with building that inventory, understanding what the business case is for various extensions that are going to be in use. I promise you'll be surprised by some of the things you find. And then, work with your user base to slowly kind of walk down those detections to the point where you can start alerting and communicating to users, and then ultimately get to that kind of block by default, which was later in that playbook that I described. But I think it's something that you build to versus implementing outright.
Great. Probably got time for one or two more questions at this point. Nadeem followed up there, just saying that basically starting with a blacklist approach and moving towards a whitelist. Exactly. Yeah. I think there's a good question here, which is, are you able to provide a cheat sheet to show the browser extension risk level by permission combination? Would love to try and apply this approach in our own environment. I think obviously you talk to the fact, Mark, that it's tough to rely on permissions alone because there are so many legitimate extensions that have abusable permissions. And I think what we've identified from our research, to support this webinar in particular, is that those permission combinations enabling that sort of highest level of risk, like session token theft, essentially, are very, very common as well. So yeah, I don't know. What do you think generally about using permissions as an indicator of risk, and how you could really operationalize that?
I mean, I think it's a very useful indicator, but it's just that it's an indicator. It's not evidence, right? So, I think it's one of several pieces of context that you have to look at when deciding kind of what's risky and acceptable and what isn't. But to more directly answer the question, and Dan, actually, I think we were talking about this internally within the last few days, right, at Push, which is we do want to provide some kind of public facing, or at least customer facing asset that kind of outlines, here are the risky permissions, here are the risky combinations specifically. As you can imagine, trying to kind of create an artifact around that that won't be misused or misinterpreted, it is a challenge. So it's a project that we're working on right now. Hopefully we'll have something that is releasable here soon, but yeah, it is a challenging thing to produce, as we're finding.
Yeah. Okay. I think that's probably most of the. I don't know if you can see any other questions there, Mark.
Yeah, there was a question about, let's see, Axel says, in addition to software inventory monitoring, are there specific KQL queries you employ to hunt for malicious browser extensions? No, I wouldn't say we use any kind of platform specific query language like Kusto, or anything like that. This is really, since we are effectively in the browsers, then we have direct access to kind of that data set, and we're actually hunting across all of the metadata from our various deployments. So we absolutely do hunting. It's a core part of the research and kind of the monitoring that we're doing on the back end. But fortunately, we don't have to rely on like a third party for that. We're just hunting in our own telemetry. And I thought there was one other question here that I wanted to speak to. Yeah, the cheat sheet one. Another one that tends to come up quite often is user training and awareness. So a lot of what we showcased here and we talked about deals with users, selectively opting into these. They're clicking on that install button they're choosing to search for and download and install extensions from Chrome Web Store, for example. So a question that we're often asked about this is, well, what about user security awareness training? Can't we train users not to do this, or at least to review some of the permissions and the other details that we've talked about to identify this threat themselves? And my answer to that is no, you can't. You can't really train your way out of this problem for a few different reasons. I think the first is that we've got some very smart and capable adversaries on the other end that are making these things look and appear as convincing as possible. The fact that they are hosted in many cases on the Chrome Web Store, there's kind of an air of legitimacy around that. So that kind of skips right past a lot of people's filters for what seems risky or not. There is either a lack of context or misleading context, as we saw in some of those examples I showed, where you've got lots of installs, you've got reasonably high ratings, you've got a legitimate appearance. And so I think it's difficult and extremely risky to put this back on the users and think that they're going to be able to distinguish between legitimate and illegitimate extensions, especially when an extension may be legitimate one day, and as we've shown with some of these campaigns, it's weaponized the next day. And so this, I don't think, is a problem to solve with user training and awareness. You have to have some stronger, controls and enforcement there in the browser to take that load off of the user.
For sure. Great. Well, I think that's probably everything. We're just about at time here. So yeah, thanks very much everybody for joining. You will all receive a copy of the recording directly to your inbox. So feel free to share that around with other team members and such. And yeah, if you do have any further questions, please reach out to us directly. And yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Dan.
Cheers. Thanks, Mark.